As we continue on in week number 2, or in topic number 2, excuse me, let's look at steps number 3 through 4, which are the historical background and significant words. Now, these steps are helpful. I wouldn't consider them the most important part of this process, but they can be very helpful, especially depending on the type of book that you're looking at. And so let's go ahead and look through these steps. Starting off, let's look at step number 3, which is the historical background. And let's look at the categories of information that are included in a historical background. Now, usually what will happen is that it'll be, if we require it in an assignment for a particular book, it'll usually be maybe at most about a page of information about these various categories. And so number 1, you'll look at the identity and background of the author. Who was the author of this book, if it can be found out? Usually it's fairly clear inside the book, especially if it's a New Testament book like the epistles of Paul or some of the things like that. It will be somewhat obvious, although not always with the Old Testament books. At times it will be. For example, if it's a prophecy of Isaiah, of course I'm going to assume initially that it's the prophet Isaiah. There are some other people who would disagree with that, and you can gather information from other sources as well, but it's pretty obviously that's the prophecies of Isaiah, at least as long as you believe the Bible, which I do. So you're going to look at the identity and background of the author. Number 2, you're going to look at the date of writing, and this may not be able to be found out with any certainty inside the book, or at least you might be able to get a relative date relative to other things that are going on in the Bible, in Bible history, but you might have to look to external resources to find an exact date, a definite date in history according to our calendar accounting, or a calendar of dates. Thirdly, you're going to look at the background or story of the time of writing, either the background of the story at the time of the story, or the background at the time of the writing. Now, I say that because there could be two different backgrounds. For example, the book of Ruth was probably written later on during the time of David. And so there's a different background for the time of the story of Ruth, which is the time of the judges, than the time of the writing, which was during the reign of David, which was later on. Ruth is the grandma of David. And so that's the that's going to be later on in history than the actual story was. And so there's a little bit of a time difference between the story and the time of writing as far as the background. And so sometimes you need to give a background for one or the other. Of course, that won't be the case in certain books. For example, the epistles, they're written when they're written, and you just have one time frame, the time frame of the writing. Now, number 4, you have the purpose for writing if it's applicable. There are some books, like, for example, New Testament epistles, where Paul will state fairly clearly why he's writing that letter, but other times you won't necessarily know exactly what the purpose for writing is, or you'll just have to make an interpretation and say, this is why it looks like this book was written. And then sometimes you'll give other information, but that's general information. I'll come back to this when we look at the various different types of writings, different types of books in the Bible. And on certain types of books, you'll need to give other categories of information as well, but we'll get to that when we get to those different types of writings. Now, after we consider the categories of information for historical background, we need to think about the methods of information gathering. How are we going to gather information for doing a historical background for a book? Number 1, gather information from the Bible book itself. And this, of course, is the most important step in gathering historical information for the historical background. And I would say this is something, though, that we oftentimes will skip. Some people will skip this, but you shouldn't skip this. Some people just go straight to a commentary or just to a Bible dictionary. But if you look at a Bible dictionary, oftentimes the information that they'll give you is either from the book itself or from other books in the Bible. And so why not just get the same information that they're going to give you anyways? Why not just go look at the Bible and see for yourself? And that can be done through a variety of different ways, usually through concordances and reading through that particular Bible book itself. So start with that individual Bible book that you're looking at, that you're studying, and look through that to find historical background information first. Secondly, gather information from the rest of the Bible. So this is where you would use a concordance and you would search through the rest of the scriptures to see what else is said about this if it's at a particular time frame. For example, at the epistles, some of the historical background for the epistles in the New Testament will be the book of Acts. You'll see what's going on. He's writing to a particular church. How and where did Paul interact with this church? You'll see a lot of information like that when you're looking in the book of Acts for the background of the epistles. And that happens in various different places throughout the Bible where you'll see background information. For example, the books of Haggai and Zechariah, if you want background information for that, you're going to have to look at the book of Ezra, as that gives the historical context for those two prophetic books. And so you need to figure out from the rest of the Bible what helps you understand the background of that book. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 is gather information from external sources. And these sources would be things like Bible dictionaries, which are very helpful, and I recommend getting a good Bible dictionary. New Bible Dictionary is a really solid Bible dictionary. And also Bible atlases, which give you not only historical but also geographical information. But those are a little bit harder to get specific information out of because they are done in a chronological format for the historical portion. And so it's difficult to try and get specific information about a particular topic out of those. Although if you have it in an electronic format, you can easily search through that and that'll give you that information as well. But it's going to be easier to look it up in a Bible dictionary. Lastly, there's also Bible commentaries, but I wouldn't recommend this just because it's also, unlike dictionaries where you can look up a topic and find that biblical topic or even the book of the Bible itself, commentaries, they'll have that information, but they'll often put on a lot of their conjuncture as well. And so I'd rather rely on the Bible dictionaries or Bible atlases to give me the information. Now, the next step is significant words. And usually, sometimes we'll call this observational worksheets or something similar to that. And this is what I'm going to give you is not a definite list, not a full list of everything, but if there's something significant later on according to a particular type of literature inside the Bible, then I'll give you maybe additional categories that can go inside of this step. Number 1 underneath here is word counts. Now this is really good. This can help you a lot, but I don't really count it as an assignment anymore because you can do it so easily through Bible programs. And so, for example, in Logos, there's actually a feature called Concordance where you can see how many, what all the words are in the particular book and which ones appear however many times you want to look for. For example, in the book of Ruth, the Hebrew word behind the words translated as relative or redeemer, the word goel, or the word goel is 21 times, occurs 21 times in the book of Ruth. And so that can be very helpful and significant. Like, wow, that's amazing. That word happens a lot of time in this book. Maybe that's a very significant concept. In fact, that's the most repeated significant word in the book of Ruth. There's other words that are repeated more, but they're, words like "and" or other words like that. That is, I'm looking at the Hebrew. And so now that you can do it on a Bible program so simply, there's no reason to have a full-on assignment where you go through and count up every single time. That's the way we used to have to do it, is we read through the whole book several times and we count up individually how many times a particular word was used, although in that case it would be only in the English. And that took a lot of time, and now you can do it just through a Bible program. So I don't do this as an assignment anymore for students, but it can be very helpful. So I would recommend getting a Bible program that can do this. And in fact, Logos, if you get a free account, you can use their online version and do this very easily with whatever Bible translation you want to. Or maybe if you buy a Bible translation, you can do the word counts for all the significant words in a particular book. Number 2, significant verb identification. This will actually be much more important when we get to the New Testament, especially when we're talking about epistles, which is one of the latter topics that we'll look at in this course. And so in probably a good 10 weeks or so, we'll start looking at that, and it's going to help a lot when we start doing that, but mainly for the New Testament, because you'll see certain verbs are the main verbs and certain verbs just help out the main concept, participles and things like that, if you're familiar with participles, but we'll get into that later when we get into the epistle portion of this course. Number 3, imperative identification. And an imperative is a command. And so anytime you see a command, it's safe to assume that God really wants you to do that. Of course, there's application that can be gotten from other parts of the Bible as well, even if the Lord doesn't give you a command. But if he does give you a command, it's probably pretty significant. Now, this one also I mostly use inside the New Testament. For example, looking at the book of Romans. How many commands are in the book of Romans? What are those commands? And so imperative identification, and I'll usually make a list of imperatives that when I've read through a book, I'll make a list of all the commands that I've seen throughout that book. That can be very helpful as well. Now, also, number 4, keyword studies. If you've seen that there is a keyword or several keywords throughout a book or even maybe one chapter, it might be good to do a separate keyword study on just that word and understand, where it's used in the rest of the Bible and understand what its deep meaning is. Not that it's not that every word you're going to find like a deep, deep meaning, but you'll be able to see maybe something significant in that word and its deeper understanding as you've searched it through the whole of Scripture and how it's used. So a keyword study can sometimes be helpful, and we'll look at that more as we go along, especially in the New Testament.